We've been interviewing Leah McGrath Goodman. She's the executive producer of a Storyville documentary, which is on the BBC iPlayer still, and it's likely to be there for apparently another 8 months. It's called Dark Secrets of a $1 Trillion Island, Garen. Garen is the children's home, which was the centre of the Jersey abuse scandal. And Leah was keeping an eye on that and is probably the journalist with most knowledge about it. And she's been following it and still does follow it. Leah is an award-winning investigative journalist and speaker. She's an author. She writes for most of the prime publications. Her interests span finance and particularly criminal finance, which would include money laundering. She's also interested in politics, in human rights, and especially children's rights. So Leah, when did you first hear about the problem in Jersey with the child abuse scandal?
So I didn't know anything about Jersey growing up. We have a New Jersey here in the United States, but nobody ever talks about Jersey Island. Americans are aware of things like, the pullover jersey that you put on your
Yeah,
body, or Jersey potatoes, or we've all heard of Jersey cows,
yeah,
but no real education on, by the way, there's a whole island called Jersey, and that's why there's a New Jersey. And
yeah.
so it was during a conversation with a friend on a plane where someone first mentioned the island to me. I was flying between New York and London quite a bit while I was living in London, and this friend was as well. And she lived on the island of Jersey. She was also an American and had married a local Jersey man. And she was just telling me this island is so um, interesting. It has all these layers of history, but it also has all these layers of corruption. And she just kind of told me a story that sounded almost too fantastic to be true, even though she lived there. And she also said, please come visit me on the island because no one ever comes to visit from America. And that she wanted to have more American friends visiting
Yeah.
her. And so that was what was the kind of genesis moment of my not only being aware of Jersey, but some of the stories, and then also flying over to see it for the first time. I didn't know about the child abuse at
No.
that time. That became clearer as things took place with headlines. It was really global headlines over Hot de la Guerra and the children's home on
Yeah.
the island
Yeah.
that caught my attention when it came to the child abuse.
So had you been interested in those kind of issues before in relation to other countries, other places, or is this your first kind of deep knowledge of child protection and the problems that can stem from that?
I would say my background is mostly in institutional corruption.
Yeah.
So covering Wall Street, covering things like the financial crisis in 2008, covering, crimes and market manipulation and stealing.
Mm.
I would say all those very cheerful things. So I was used to complicated subjects, I would say dark subjects, frankly, and people who often would have a sort of organic situation that would grow around a corrupt situation where you'd have friends and colleagues, and as time passed and sometimes even decades, you had multiple people more or less involved or with knowledge of what was happening
Mm.
but not really doing anything about it. And frankly, that would often come from initially from profiting off of it, but then over time these human relationships would develop around it as well, where you wouldn't want to betray somebody, even if you knew what you were doing was wrong. And so I became very interested in how these institutional or systemic uh, circles or societies or groups engaged in corruption, how they developed.
And so
And
could
it
you
was
relate
really
that
that.
to could you relate that to what you were finding in Jersey, that experience? Did it cross over?
Yeah, over the years of covering these sorts of things in many forms, you get, unfortunately, as you all know in your own work as a psychiatrist and a lawyer, you develop a radar that becomes pretty good. After a while, you almost can't even explain how it works, right? Because you've seen so many situations. And so as soon as I saw the dig under the children's home in Jersey, and that the police officers leading that dig were being attacked, and that anyone involved in speaking out in defense of children on the island, for example, the Senator Stuart Seavray, who was the most senior senator at the time, right? All of them being wildly attacked, smeared. I just said that just set off a million alarm bells pretty much immediately. I'd never seen people be so angry about child abuse being investigated in my life.
And so how quickly did you have to get moving? Because by the time they were digging up the children's home, things had already been moving, hadn't they? People had been coming forward and explaining about their abuse, their own experiences, and Sivre was there in the target zone already. So you had to get moving quite fast into filming anything or recording anything.
Well, so the documentary came several years later, and in my case, the interviews that I began doing earlier than that, or I would say I started doing interviews shortly after I learned about the dig. But I had a very different attitude about the story. I was not there to break the news. I wasn't there to, show up with all the journalists who were writing headlines and hyperventilating over the story. I was much more interested in what happened here on a larger and more holistic level. What went on, what happened, and that included everything that was happening then, but also what happened later too. So when I made a commitment to the project, I was more interested in going over all the recent stuff that had gone down and also finding more about the history. And then there was an aftermath that lasted for quite some time. And I honestly, as a journalist, what you want to do is you want to study a subject, but not affect it. But my simply paying so much attention to it probably did affect it to some extent, because no other international journalist was giving it consistent year by year attention. And I found the whole story to be endlessly fascinating because there were so many different phases of either trying to conceal what had taken place or explain what had taken place, or there was the child abuse inquiry that followed a few years later. So really understanding the whole story, not just, a headline was.
And am I right? You weren't actually publishing anything. You were simply observing at that stage, because the newspapers and people did publish headlines, as you say, and there were various stories came out, but you weren't publishing those. You were observing.
So we have different terms in news. We would call spot news, right? That's what you do when you're running to the scene and the building is burning and building burns, and that's that live stuff that's happening. It's the as it happens stuff. That is just hard news. I would call it spot news. It's not deeply analytical. It usually doesn't have a lot of context. It's just, here's the news. Here's the news, and that's it. We don't have very much room here. We only have 5 paragraphs, but we're telling you what we call that reporting of record, like a record of the event, basically. I do a different kind of journalism, which is, and I do reporting of record occasionally, but mainly now in my career, I do much more deeper analytical over time journalism, which is long form. So I have and did pretty much immediately start writing really long pieces about Jersey. But the first year or so, I didn't want anyone knowing I was looking. It was really obvious that looking was not welcome. You didn't need to go to the island and talk to anyone to see very clearly anyone going near it was being attacked and discouraged and undermined. So I knew early on I have to go over and just start talking to people and meeting people and just really seeming like I am just visiting, but not necessarily doing anything. And so that was the first period, and that was very quiet work. So I wasn't going over I'm a journalist, everybody, I'm here to take quotes and put up headlines. And I felt like the only way to get to the truth would be to start just investigating quietly and see what I could find.
So you spoke to some of the survivors, did you? Some of the victims?
Yeah, there's quite a few survivors, and over time, some have come forward. There's some people I've interviewed who only talked to me once or twice, and then that was all they wanted to do. it's very painful. It can be really hard.
Yeah.
There's others that have stayed involved for years. But yeah, there's quite a few people to talk to. And I still get people coming to me, just in the last couple of months, totally new people I've never even knew were out there. So it's ongoing for sure.
Still going on.
Oh no,
Well,
all
still,
previous victims,
I'm
but
saying the people coming forward are still going.
yeah.
I see.
People who I never met. You were
Right.
asking about talking to survivors. So yeah, there are new survivors who come forward and not necessarily new experiences they're having.
Right.
Again, the islands, I mean, what's happening live right now to children on the island is definitely something that's very tricky, because they are one of the tricky things, as you know, about children's services is in the process of protecting children, they're also kind of making it impossible for anyone to really observe whether or not the children are being treated well until after the fact. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just on that point, we've spoken to a policeman who says that some of the people he wanted to interview are still in post in children's services. So
are still
anyway,
what in children's services?
they're still working in children's services
Now.
now.
Like employees.
Yeah, still employed. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But so who else were you able to speak to? Were you able to speak to some of the senior government officials?
Yeah, I mean, it's been more than a decade, so I've talked to everyone. I mean, anyone and everyone who will talk or would like to talk, I've spoken to, from the government officials to, people in legal services, social services, the survivors themselves. There are many, many, many witnesses to what has happened on the island at this point. The big challenge really is making sure that at this, honestly, like, there's too many people really to write about all of them. The hardest part really is narrowing down the storytelling to like key people, key situations, key events that help explain for ordinary people who aren't familiar with these issues, help them understand what's going on the island. So yeah,
Because,
as far as the totality, it's quite a bit.
yeah.
I'm laughing because I'm like, oh my gosh.
I know.
Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
You have
yeah.
to.
It's a lot. And it can be very overwhelming, as you might imagine.
Yes.
There are days where I literally have to tell people, please, I gotta sleep.
Yeah.
I'm here for you, but I also have to sleep because I'm a person who has to sleep too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're overwhelmed by that then, really, by the number of people.
It can be super overwhelming, especially right after a story's published. People will like flood in, and usually right after a story is published when I'm my most tired because I just get the big story out. Yeah. So the last piece that I did in March was like that. Like, it was just this flood of people, immediately after that piece went out.
So would I be right to say that they're still in touch and they're still irate because they don't think that it's been sorted out properly and that most of it's been shoved under the carpet again?
It's kind of even sadder than that. You have people like Neil McMurray, who you've interviewed on your podcast, who is very active on the island and blogging about what's happening.
Yeah.
When he sees what he considers concerning situations, either with the police or with the government or with corruption or politicians, or with survivors of abuse. For me, the hardest part is there's too many people who are still in immediate ongoing crisis on the island. And it's not just survivors of abuse, it's anyone who's vulnerable, whether it's an elderly person or somebody who doesn't maybe have enough money and they're finding themselves in a terrible situation. One man I interviewed he was a witness of some pretty horrific stuff at Haut de la Garenne. He's not a survivor of abuse, but he saw several things that are impossible for anyone to dismiss. And he told me he did not want to come forward because he said, in his estimation, the Jersey government will destroy your life if you stick your head above the parapet. They will find something and they'll come and get you. And it sounds ridiculous, right? who would have the time for that? Who would have the resources for that, to come after every person, no matter how small? But the stories that I've gathered are pretty phenomenal, where people talk about, I never had a problem, then I reported this thing I saw, and suddenly the police are pulling them over to check their, driver's license. The police are knocking on their door. Come down, we have some questions. Why? Oh, there's somebody complained about you. Neil had a situation like that, I might add. Just come to the police station. Someone complained about you. And he asked for more information. Well, just come, just come down. And if you have nothing to hide, then nothing will go wrong. And you're like,
Wow.
no one trusts that anymore on the island. They all say, right, I know what this is. And it's because I said this other thing.
Yeah.
And suddenly everyone's coming for me. They'll get harassed in their job. Somebody else, another person on the island who has come forward quite a bit, immediately not only was harassed at his job, but his wife was getting harassed, like, at her job. And it's a small island. It's also very, very wealthy. They actually do have the resources to single people out and really frighten them, frankly. I've seen enough people over the last 10 years who've been bankrupted, who've been thrown out of their jobs, who've been driven away, like Graham Power and Lenny Harper were, the police officers who were doing the dig under the home.
Yeah.
When they were investigating Hotel Le Garin, Stuart Searay lost his job, the senator. So, there's for each person who we know of, there's like 10 or 15 others I could rattle off without pause to you on this podcast, which I won't do to you.
And then
who are the same, who had the same thing happen. And so, it's there's as much as you can bear to look at. And I haven't seen, I keep waiting for that year to come where I say, right, I think I got the full measure of it. I think I have everything.
And you haven't
still
yet.
Not there yet. No, it's bottomless. I mean, it seems to be without end. And for such a small island, I must have been out of my mind, because when I first started looking at it, I thought, right, this will take a few months to investigate and I'll write my thing and then I'll be done. I've just never seen something that had so much bottomlessness to it. It's an embarrassment of riches, as we say in journalism. There's so much more. I could write a book a year and be 95 and still be doing it and still not be done. Yeah.
What did you make of the other journalists, Leah? That, the journalists that you were watching, not necessarily talking to perhaps, but watching when they were there on the island and outside Hotel Le Garin, and the dig was going on and they were following the police round and having their interviews. What did you make of it all?
I think that a lot of the journalists didn't know what to make of it either. I think a lot of those journalists were prepared to just write a story and go home. And the story kept changing in ways that didn't make a whole lot of sense.
No.
They were being told one day that children's remains were found, and then immediately someone would be trying to spin that in the other direction. And as you saw in the film Garin that we worked on, there was a scene with a journalist saying, how could we have children's remains and now we don't?
Yeah.
Like, how can it be that there's this happening and then suddenly it's gone? And, that's not normal. That's not normal. That's not normal on any island.
No.
Certainly not in a Western democracy. Although I would say democracy in quotes for Jersey.
Yeah.
But still highly unusual. And really, you can't one day find children's remains and then suddenly say that there aren't any. And then that was part of the problem.
You did interview, or interviews were done, I don't know who did the interviews, of a couple of kindly looking old white-haired men who had been part of the government, senators or...
like Frank Walker, who had been the chief minister at the time.
That's right. Yeah. And they come across as kind of baffled, slightly kind of put out, embarrassed by the whole thing, and very reasonable, trying to, minimize the harm done to everybody. But I wonder if you ever saw the ugly side of that, because, they don't come across as viciously vengeful. At least they try not to. But did you see the other side of the government at all, where you see how this power is wielded, how people are in fact crushed? Did you get any sense of that, or was it always just like the people on the receiving end could tell you this had happened?
So one thing I found interesting about the interviews with both Frank Walker and Prashad, who was the other man, Frank Walker basically said that they wanted to drive Graham Power out. He slipped, and he's he was saying, "Oh yeah, we did want to get rid of him. Oh well, yeah, we did." So when you say evidence of crushing others, he basically admitted it right on camera. It's insane, but he did. And so he can have his little, I think you notice a lot of them had these very beautiful homes, and you can sit in your beautiful home and tell everybody you're great and everything is fine. But, in a very short interview, he managed to slip and say, we were trying to get rid of Graham Power, more or less. Not more or less, very literally.
Yes, more.
And then Prashad talking about how Stuart Sevray, the health minister, should top himself. Right.
Yeah, that popped out. Didn't it?
That wasn't good, was it? No.
Americans don't understand what top yourself means. You have to explain to them. It's very, very witty. It is very witty. Like topping yourself is, the implication is you can do no higher act than offing yourself. Which is very funny when you think about it in a very gallows humor type of way. But it was a horrific thing for one incoming health minister to say to the outgoing health minister, who was thrown out because he was advocating for child abuse victims.
Yeah.
And telling him, and he also said, you should go slit your wrist. So, then obviously that was not good. It didn't go well. And then you saw in the film, again, this man is interviewed about what he said, and he basically said, well, I actually just should have told him he was, and he used some disgusting slur. I don't know if you saw that on camera. I thought, oh my God, I mean, you just said you shouldn't have said it, and then you added,
you said it.
You should have said a slur. I mean, also, not only a slur, but a slur that's considered pretty like anti-woman, to be honest. So I just was like, I mean, so they didn't come off to me at all as like civilized or thoughtful or conscientious, or even aware of the damage of their own behavior. They didn't seem to have reflected very much to me. But again, I think that camera interviews are always very tricky, right? Depending on who's editing that interview, could have been that they did say some reflective things and it wasn't included in the film.
Yeah.
I wasn't in charge of the final edits for the film. The BBC was. Honestly, I'm not sure if the BBC edited it in a way that was honest. So it's important, obviously, when you're recording somebody to really get the full sense of what they were really conveying. So I don't know if it was fair to Frank Walker. I don't know if it was fair to Prashad, but I do know what they did use didn't look very good.
Yeah.
And you were on the receiving end yourself at one point, because we know about your experience at Heathrow when you were on your way to Jersey. Could you just summarize what happened? That was a bizarre experience as well, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, so just to give context to your listeners, I started looking at Jersey during the dig. I was finishing up my first book. I was living in New York at the time, and I had no interest at the time in looking at what was going on over there. But when I saw the dig under the children's home, and then they were finding children's remains, and all the fighting that followed over what was really found, whether or not the police officers should be driven out of their jobs, whether or not the health minister, Stuart Sevray, should be driven out of his job. When all that fighting ensued, I thought, right, I need to just take a little time over there and find out what's really going on. And to me, it was going to hinge initially, and I still think this was the right way to look at it. I thought it's going to have everything to do with these two police officers. How solid were they? How careful were they? Was it really a mess or not? I didn't know them. I needed to sit with them and actually hear what they had to say and get a sense of if they were conscientiously doing their jobs or if it was sort of a mess, the way it was being portrayed in the press.
Yeah.
And yeah. And as soon as I met them both, I was very impressed with both of them. And
Yeah.
I thought that was when I decided this is a story. These people were clearly doing their very best and everything they possibly could.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized this is a real story. These aren't just people who messed up an investigation. But those first 2 years between 2009 and when I started actually traveling regularly to the island, I was quietly meeting everyone and quietly connecting, and almost no one wanted to talk in the beginning. Almost nobody. I literally had to take a train to Scotland and showed up at Lenny Harper's front door, basically
Wow.
apologizing, saying, I really would like to talk to you. I am so sorry. Please kick me out if you don't want to talk to me. But like, I really do want to look at this. And same with Stuart Seaver. He was very wary, didn't want to talk to a journalist. Everyone required a lot of special, careful
Yeah.
approaching.
Yeah.
And it took about 2 years before I started to really say, right, I can regularly go to the island. And that was when things got bad, because I started openly traveling to the island instead of quietly researching. And it was 2011 that I was traveling from the US to Jersey, and you have to pass through a UK airport on the way to Jersey. There's no direct flight between like New York City and Jersey. And that was where I was detained, questioned, and it was a very misleading, nasty process, because they made it sound like they just want to ask me a couple of questions, but they locked me in a room in the basement for over 12 hours, which is a legal limit, and tried to interrogate me, tried to go through all my things. It was very confrontational and hostile. And most of the time I was down there, they just had me locked up in a room without speaking to me. The first thing they wanted to do was go through my luggage, which to me felt like a fishing expedition, because I'd never had an issue with my visa. I'd never had an issue traveling. I have a completely clean record of all, clean travel record, clean background, no crime, etc.
Yeah.
I was just a young woman going on a writing research trip. So I didn't understand what on earth they would want to lock me up for. And they wouldn't tell me. They didn't give me any information.
And they wouldn't let you have a lawyer, would they? You couldn't ask anybody.
No, they wouldn't let me. I can tell you that I was quite nasty as soon as they locked me in. I can tell you I am not, I'm a very nice person, but if you do something like that, I become a supercilious, ferocious, haughty, you know what? And I was fit to be tied. I basically berated them the entire time. I'm
Good
sure
for
it was
you.
highly unpleasant for them, but I was like, I was furious, and it was not a good situation. It was, I'm sure that they couldn't wait to get me out of there, because they knew that I wasn't just going to go quietly.
No, that was good.
Yeah, it was bad. And the interrogations were ridiculous. They wanted to know who I was talking to, where I was living. And I was like, who wants to know? Like, can I have a alert? No? Okay. What kind of operation are you running here? And they basically said, you don't have any representation because you're not in the UK and you're not anywhere. So you don't really have rights here. And it turned out that Heathrow is a black site. Before you're officially admitted, it's black. It's the same thing with the Eurotunnel and with Gatwick, which I did not know. And I think a lot of people don't know.
People should know.
Yeah, it is. And they wouldn't let me contact my embassy. They wouldn't let me contact a lawyer. I was allowed to call my hotel to cancel my stay, but that was it, which is totally strange.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they kept calling my partner to try to see if they could get him to say anything that might hurt me in some way, which was very strange, because he was completely bewildered. Like, who are these people calling and asking all these personal questions? So I was being treated as a person of interest, but I had no idea why.
Do you know what organization they belong to? Were they police or Home Office people, or do you know what they were?
It was the UK border agency. So yeah, that's part of the Home Office.
Yeah.
And the Home
And
Office, of course, has been implicated in lots of child abuse scandals. So it's, it's not a good situation when you're being locked up over child abuse.
You didn't get to Jersey, did you? They sent you back to the US, didn't they?
Yeah, after 12 hours, I was just kind of sitting waiting for some kind of a verdict after the talk. They didn't have anything really to use. So eventually they came back with, well, we're not sure how long you'll stay. Maybe you'll overstay your visa. And I said, seeing as I've never even gotten close to overstaying my visa ever, like, how likely is that like an argument? Like, how likely is that going to be like an effective argument? It was very, as you say in England, it was very disproportionate reaction to just somebody traveling. And so I actually they are able to see your flight manifests when they do this to you. Like, they can actually look and see, like, where does your flight go? And then where do your other flights go? And I was pre-booked already to go to Vienna to speak at a conference. And they could see all that. And I actually had all the paperwork. I was like, you can see I'm only in Jersey a few days.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to Vienna. And then you can see the flight back to New York. It just made no sense. And we don't know. Maybe you'll try to overstay or, okay, but you have absolutely no evidence, quite frankly, evidence the contrary. My paperwork also showed a change of address from one New York address to another, which again confirmed that I lived in New York. So the whole thing was very odd. They obviously just didn't want me investigating the children's home.
It's obvious.
It sounds like you got the B team on you, though. They didn't sound very bright.
They really had no idea what was going on. The people interrogating me were bewildered. I actually felt a little sorry for them because the guy couldn't figure out what was going on. And I told him, I'm investigating the children's home in Jersey, and the Jersey immigration folks, I just disclosed to them the work I'm doing. I had just disclosed to them like days earlier. And that was while I was getting approved for a temporary flat, which was a non-domiciled flat, which is for people who don't live there, but who are using a place to stay. So it was during that process that immigration on the island of Jersey asked me, this is before I was detained, asked me, well, what are you here to do? And I said, I'm a journalist. Well, what are you writing about? And I said, I'm looking at Hot Deligaran. I figured at that point, there was no reason to be misleading because even if no one was going to figure it out right away, they were going to eventually find out. So and that triggered this series of events. I was deported and I was sent a letter saying I would be banned from entering not just the United Kingdom, but the Channel Islands and Jersey for the next 2 years. And that's when there was a campaign to overturn my ban, which did work, thank God. But it took quite some time and it was a lot of upset and arguing and people involved to overturn my ban, which is a story in and of itself.
Right. Have you on the island when you've been there felt uncomfortable, had actual threats or just felt uncomfortable that, you may be being followed or, anything that made you feel I'm not safe here?
I had a really good piece of advice from Glenn Greenwald, of all people, whose partner, David Miranda, was detained at the airport in London and had a similar sort of black site lockup interrogation situation. In my case, I was not bringing flash drives with government data on them. So I believe the UK courts ultimately ruled that the US had a right to detain him because of the flash drives and because there was US data on them. However, Glenn Greenwald, I remember talking to him about all this, and he just said, at some point you have to take the precautions and then you just got to do the job. You gotta take logical precautions and then you can't let your emotions get involved. You just have to, do the things that will protect you and then just get on with it. And I think he's right. There have been times one member of parliament, Jersey has its own parliament, as you know, has its own currency, its own parliament, its own laws. It's a completely self-contained system. It has its own mails, like its own Jersey mailing system, Jersey Postal Service. If you send a package to Jersey, you can't get tracking.
Right.
It'll stop in London or England. You can't find out if it ever really arrived in Jersey. We won't track, and it tells you so much about how Jersey works.
Yeah.
It has its own telecom company. Again, that's your phones, your internet, your every last thing that you will have to connect you to the outside world is completely controlled by Jersey if you're in Jersey. So this member of parliament asked about me when I was banned, and it turned out they were surveilling me. He got some information from immigration saying that they had been watching me and filing reports on me. So that was a little surprising because, again, a journalist doesn't look at themselves that way.
No.
Most journalists, I'm sure they're very, very arrogant, self-aggrandized journalists who think that they're that important that someone would surveil them. But I found it a little much. I just thought they're going to be pretty bored watching me get coffee, typing, and a journalist's life is it is not exciting looking. It sounds glamorous, but I mean, most of it's a lot of typing and coffee.
And hard work.
Yeah, like phone calls. You're just like, I don't know if there was anything exciting about surveilling me. Even watching where I go, like I would go into an apartment complex maybe and do an interview, but you don't really know whose house I'm in, or unless you're following me right through the gate, you're not really going to know very much. So one of the biggest complaints that Jersey sent to me, a lawyer sent me a letter, and he said, well, we can't figure out what you're doing.
Oh dear.
We think you're being scattershot and we can't follow it. And, I thought, well, I mean, like, it's really none of your business.
No.
So yeah, I have had that happen. Yes. And I'm sure there's other things I don't want to know about that have happened.
And how does the island look to you now because being an American, we've had the War of Independence. You've separated from the royal family, and then you step back into something medieval where really the royal family is in direct control of the whole of the island, and much as the local people might choose the bailiff or whatever, they are nominally at least appointed by the Queen. And
and they don't. The people do not choose their crown officers. They have no say over it. The key people running the island are appointed by the Queen. The people living on the island don't have any say in that, and they have a stranglehold on how things work. So it really is Queen, and then 5 crown officers, and then this parliament that the crown officers, the Queen appoints the crown officers, and then parliament is democratically elected, but the crown officers still get to rule it with a fist. They still get to rule the Jersey Royal Court with a fist. So people don't feel empowered. The island has some of the lowest voting rates that I've seen for any territory. And, it's not a system of government that makes people feel like they matter. They ultimately, including members of parliament on the island, are often saying things can be found saying things like, we don't really know who's running anything, and they're in the parliament and they're saying that. So there's a feeling that other decisions are being made over the top of what is presenting itself as a democracy, but that really the main decisions are not being made democratically. And
but there's a kind of Cosa Nostra type of relationship at the top there, isn't there? With you're in the group. You're a made man if you're, and presumably some women, if you're part of that accepted group who make the decisions. But the capo di tutti capi is actually the Queen, isn't it?
Yeah, and I actually am not studied in the other allegories and comparisons we might draw. Like I have to be careful because I don't know how accurate they really are to each other. But I will say, the Queen certainly has the control here, but I suspect that because she's such a stickler for tradition, that a lot of things that could be done to make this better are just simply not done because they've never been done. So the island is quasi-feudal. It is, it's supposed to be a democracy, but it's mostly the Queen's Island run by the Queen with some small nods to the idea of democracy without actually following through on them. And it's not like it became this way. A lot of people say, oh, well, how did this all happen? And you have to say, it's always been this way there. Like, it's not that it became this way, it was this way. And it's made it ideal it's ideally suited to be a tax shelter, because there's this supreme control being wielded over it by a very small number of people, many of them very wealthy and very connected to the banking, finance, and legal industries over there. And it's a very convenient offshore shelter for England, for people in the Middle East. You'll see a lot of money coming from the Middle East and also Europe. And so it's a highly protected, tiny island with just so much money, $2 trillion of money by some estimates it's literally like a 5 by 9 mile island, right? So that's a lot of money per square mile or kilometer. And there's a lot of focus on protecting that and making sure no matter what, that's never threatened. And just to be really clear, it's a carve out of the EU. It's not ruled by the EU. It's not ruled by the UK. Like, Jersey is its own territory. It is not a part of the EU. It is not a part of the UK. It's like its own little country and has its own laws and its own everything else. And so it's locked up real tight. There's nothing that's going to get in or out that isn't pre-approved and agreed upon. And so somebody like me, or police officers investigating something and really doing a real investigation, or a member of parliament on the island who's trying to get to the bottom of something, that's considered a very big deal and must be stopped a lot of the time. And that's what makes it so astounding. If somebody had described this to me, I wouldn't have believed it if somebody had told me about it before I looked at it myself.
What's the main motivation, Leah? Is it because they're worried about the reputation of the island as a tax haven? So they just cannot admit that there might be any abuse of children going on? Or is there something else as well? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, they don't want to risk the reputation of the island, but I will say, I think it's even more serious than that. The island, I received a number of documents this last year that shows that the island is a very serious site for, unbelievable money laundering. But, a lot of the papers that you can get from some of those, there's some really great information available now from some of the money laundering leaks that have taken place. And so this one leak that I was the recipient of this past year, it shows so much flowing through the island, with the island's judges actively involved, and some of them crown officers actively involved. And we're talking, global money laundering, we're talking arms deals, we're talking the kinds of stuff that is, traditionally known as the quote unquote second economy, which is child trafficking, arms dealing, drug dealing, money laundering, the really dark stuff, and the stuff that has so much money going through that if you're making that kind of money, you don't want it to stop. So I think Jersey, it wants to have that really nice external reputation, but the thing is down the middle, under the surface, this stuff is really dark. And I think it likes the idea of having both, because that second economy is highly lucrative. Like, it's a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
The money that we see is only part of what's happening in the world today. So it's the stuff we're not seeing. Well, where is it going? Well, it's going to places like Jersey that have total control over what's happening on the island. And so they certainly have an incentive to protect that if they want to keep that money coming through. They also want to be known as an island that is polished and professional, that when you look under the surface, a lot of times its own regulator will not apprehend fraud. Its own police officers will not investigate crime. Its own crown officers will make excuses about why everything's fine. And the members of parliament will be kept completely in the dark. so often I'll talk to somebody, and there was a global scandal last autumn about money laundering on the island. None of the members of parliament knew about it because no newspaper on the island would report on it. You had global newspapers all around the world writing about it, and nobody on the island even knew.
And just to be
completely in the dark.
And just to be clear, money laundering is only necessary if money is the product of crime or is not being paid in taxes to the local, to where taxes are due. I mean, there's a reason why it has to be laundered. It's not simply moving it around the world for convenience. It has to be done because it's the product of
crime,
some kind of crime, and it's then laundered so it can be used to fund businesses which appear legitimate, which compete with legal businesses. And
there's a lot of reasons why. So one of the reasons can be you want to hide the source of the money. You don't want people to know where the money really came from. That's one of the big reasons. But it can be something as simple, and I've seen these cases in Jersey, as I don't want the wife to get the Botticelli in the divorce.
Right.
Okay.
So we need to make it disappear. And the way we do it is we create a fake debt note, and we tell her that I had a debt, and then we paid it with the Botticelli, so it's gone, but it's not really gone because the debt wasn't really real.
Right.
And so, it can also just be dumb games of hide and seek in a divorce with some very wealthy people, where they have to do a little fake paperwork, or it can be a lot of things. Things tend to need to be laundered because you need to hide what's really happening on some level. It's in a simple way of putting it.
So it comes naturally to hide child abuse because it's embarrassing. It's your friends. You don't want to. They may know secrets that you want to, about you, that you want to keep secret, etc. It's a whole.
I think the islands had a high tolerance for secrecy, and came into it pretty, again, organically. I don't feel like everyone got together one day at a big bonfire in the center of town and said, let's do this. I don't think that's how it happened.
No, it's baked into the culture by the sound of it.
Yeah, the island itself has, and I've had local Jersey people tell me I'm being too charitable, but the island itself, it's been attacked, by the Romans, by the Vikings, by the French, by the English, by the Nazis. They have a reason for feeling like, hey, we're going to stick together. And you know what? We don't know if we trust people outside of this place. They come by it very honestly. And, there's a term on the island, they'll often very easily call any number of things or people enemies of the island. I heard it all the time when I first started coming. Somebody would be talking about something, oh, they're enemies of the island. And I'd never heard anyone talk like that. Can you imagine visiting somebody in Parliament or somebody at Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and having them say, oh, they're enemies of America, or they're enemies of Whitehall, or, it's just it's almost like a wartime way of looking at something that never went away. Like the war is always happening. And the idea of outsiders looking at them and potentially looking at them in a way that might be unkind without understanding their history is for them very abhorrent, which I don't blame them.
But it's a little charitable because you could look at Belgium, for example, which kept getting invaded from different directions. Poland. I mean, it's not like they've got a uniquely dreadful experience of being invaded. There are countries all over Europe that have had armies marching through them,
I think if you saw a small town have to deal with this, right, you have to kind of imagine, like, we're talking 100,000 people. So that's like Boston or something. You have to think about how small it is and the enormity of what's happened there. And so it's not like they weren't, a country. They were abandoned during World War II. Winston Churchill literally sent a boat and said, hey, if you want to put some of your kids on the boat, or you can just hang out on the island and take your chances, but we're not defending you. We're not going to be looking out for you in the Nazis' land. You can either come to England or stick it out over there. So I think that there was a lot of very frightening experiences that have taken place not too long ago. And when we're talking about the child abuse on the island, there's still a fairly recent memory of pretty scary, horrific situations. And I think that there's in some ways a brutalization of the population to some extent, where it doesn't register maybe things the way maybe other places would. And because the island specializes in secrecy and specializes in concealing things, I don't doubt that, and I have, many of the accounts from survivors have backed up the notion of, children were just, it was a little bit of a free for all at that children's home. So if you were a prominent person like Jimmy Savile, who was prominent at the time and was politically connected and was a big star at the BBC, if he wanted to go to the children's home and do kind of whatever he wanted, he was allowed. And that happened many times at that children's home at Haute de la Garenne and other children's homes on the island. I think that there was a feeling of, well, it's an island and it's a secretive island. So if anything happens there, I think that Jersey really stopped keeping track of how many things were going on. And then suddenly it had almost 200 children coming forward, survivors all around the world during the Haute de la Garenne investigation, which was called Operation Rectangle. During Operation Rectangle, so many people came forward, there could no longer be this excusing of what had taken place. Whereas in the past, someone would come forward and the island would just crush them, they'd destroy them so that they didn't speak again. Now you had all these people. You can't trust almost 200 survivors all telling their stories at the same time. Like, you can't explain that away anymore. So I think that island it has gotten by for many years on just crushing dissent. And it still does it now. And it does it very, very well. Do you have anything to say as a psychiatrist? And do you have anything to say as a lawyer, both who've worked in the children's,
Well, I mean, what I'm thinking about what you're saying is that if you are aware that you're doing all sorts of bad things, which if they came out, you'd be in trouble for, there is a tendency to see the world as your enemy. And of course, you can always rationalize that by saying, see how badly I was treated in the past. Therefore, I'm justified in seeing the world as my enemy. When in fact, you're quite right, because the world would be your enemy if they knew what you were doing. So I think there's two sides to that history of, being badly treated. I think you can bring bad treatment on yourself by behaving badly. Everybody's got an excuse for behaving badly if they want to find one.
It's actually quite sad. One of the hardest things about my own work is I'm very much drawn to complicated stories where you see what's public about them and you say, well, I need to look under the hood and see what's really going on. What we can see is hard to understand. Let's find out what really happened. And it's almost always such a sad story. That's the hard thing about the job, is you usually don't come out saying, oh, all these people are just evil.
Well, there's a distinction to make, though, isn't there, between something being understandable and something being excusable. You can certainly understand all sorts of things, which humans do, but that doesn't make it excusable, even though you may have all sorts of reasons for having done it.
And crushing a population, crushing children, not allowing the light to come into these circumstances is appalling, Leah.
That's the thing about that island that's so upsetting. They got into a habit of saying, well, child abuse happens everywhere. So what makes us why you have to come after us?
So what? Why pick on us?
They would normalize. They would use this normalizing language, which you saw Frank Walker basically said that in his interview, the former chief minister. He basically said, well, child abuse happens in lots of places. So
deal with it then, I would say. Deal with it.
Well, that's exactly. That's the part they don't seem so good at is, right, yes, child abuse does happen in many places, but that's not the end of it.
No.
That's not, you don't stop there.
No.
And your problem isn't that you have had child abuse, although I do think they have a uniquely bad problem because of the looking the other way that goes on.
Yeah.
But the big problem is inability to apprehend it. And they basically won't ever put someone in jail on the island if the person's wealthy enough or powerful enough. Like, nobody ever goes to jail who's wealthy enough or powerful enough on the island of Jersey.
So
it's just not done.
I would say then that the conclusion we have to draw is that children are simply not safe on that island.
Yeah,
And that's a big deal.
That's what Stuart Seavray stood up and said in Parliament right before they voted him out, because he said it.
Yeah.
He said, I can say hand on heart, the children are not safe on this island. And everybody lost their minds. How dare he? He's undermining his own health department, and this, the social services folk are so, demoralized by this statement. And and he basically said, I'm sorry to have to say it, but it's true.
Absolutely.
So you're right.
It sounds as though it's still true.
Yeah.
From what we are gathering, that remains the case. But of course, again, I bring it back to the royal family that they have their own problems with child abuse within the immediate ranks of the royal family, and children may not be safe anywhere where they're in charge.
I think, as we've seen more recently, the royal family seems to have its own issues. It seems to have issues.
People are not protected.
Yeah, like toxicity issues inside the family that are now obviously spilling into the public, but they're having a hard time just keeping their own immediate house in order, let alone their territories and their.
And tradition is venerated above anything else.
Yeah,
which is what we're seeing.
It's sad, and this is not to knock the Queen. I've had a lot of people on the island. The island is not part of the UK, but a lot of them are royalists, is what I would say, and they're very much, the Queen is their figurehead, and
well, you have to say, how's it going?
Which is, negatively. Yeah, no, but I mean, even people who say it's not going well are like, but I am a royalist, and and it's tradition. Like, they are used to looking well upon her, and the point of this conversation and others that look critically at this is not, oh, let's just bash the Queen. Like, this is not an easy job. I don't think Elizabeth II did not have it easy here. Nobody's saying this was going to be easy, but it would be nice to see her pay a little more attention to some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Leah, thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.
It's very kind of you to talk to us.
You too. I would love to speak with you more sometime soon. Take care.
We will.
We will.